The fastest way to destroy your career is to humiliate the right person in front of the wrong camera. The words would make sense to Officer Claire Whitmore later, but on that gray Tuesday afternoon in downtown Washington, D.C., she had no idea how close she was to learning that lesson. News vans lined the curb outside the federal courthouse. Satellite dishes pointed toward a sky heavy with rain. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder behind metal barricades, microphones ready, waiting for a live segment covering a growing debate about public trust in law enforcement. Red tally lights blinked on cameras across the plaza. Millions of viewers were watching. Claire adjusted her uniform and scanned the crowd with practiced confidence. She had built a reputation for being decisive, visible, and unafraid to take control when situations became chaotic. Today was supposed to be another routine public appearance. Then a small disturbance near the front of the crowd changed everything. A young girl, no older than 12, stumbled after being bumped by people rushing toward the cameras. Papers scattered across the wet pavement. Most people barely noticed. They were too busy chasing the story. One man did notice. He stepped forward immediately, helping gather the papers before the wind could carry them away. He wore a dark overcoat that had clearly seen better days. No security detail surrounded him. No assistants followed him. To everyone nearby, he looked like an ordinary older man trying to help a frightened child. The girl thanked him quietly. He smiled and handed back the last sheet. For a moment, the scene should have ended there. It didn't. Claire spotted the movement from across the plaza. Through the noise, flashing lights, and confusion of live television, she misread what she was seeing. Her expression hardened. She moved toward them quickly. Cameras instinctively followed. Reporters sensed tension and turned their microphones in her direction. Within seconds, the ordinary interaction became the center of attention. "Sir, step back," Claire said firmly. The man looked at her, calm and composed. Rain tapped softly against the courthouse steps behind him. "Officer," he replied, his voice even. "I'm only helping her collect her papers." The girl nodded immediately. "He helped me," she said, but the growing crowd swallowed her words. Claire was already convinced she understood the situation. The cameras moved closer. Viewers at home leaned toward their screens. The man never raised his voice. He never argued. He simply stood beside the child while the wind pushed rain across the marble plaza. Something about his composure irritated Claire even more. Most people became nervous when confronted publicly. This man seemed almost impossible to rattle. The reporters exchanged glances. The atmosphere shifted. Nobody realized they were witnessing the first moments of a story that would dominate headlines across the country. Because the quiet man standing in the rain was not who he appeared to be. And before the day was over, the entire nation would learn his name. The rain grew steadier, turning the courthouse plaza into a mirror of silver reflections and blurred camera lights. Malcolm Hayes barely seemed to notice. He stood beside Lena Carter while she carefully gathered the last of her papers, protecting them from the wind with both hands. The girl looked nervous, not because of the cameras, but because hundreds of strangers suddenly seemed interested in a moment that had started with a simple act of kindness. Malcolm offered her a reassuring smile. "Take your time," he said softly. "Nothing important should be rushed because other people are impatient." The words sounded ordinary, yet something about them carried weight. Lena nodded and slipped the papers into a worn blue folder. She noticed that Malcolm spoke with a calm confidence she rarely heard from adults. There was no frustration in his voice, no desire to impress anyone. Around them, reporters continued whispering into microphones. Producers spoke into headsets. Camera operators adjusted lenses as droplets of rain rolled down expensive equipment. Everyone was chasing a story. Malcolm seemed completely uninterested in becoming one. That was not unusual for him. For most of his life, he had preferred listening over speaking and observing over being noticed. Even now, dressed in a simple overcoat and carrying an umbrella that had clearly survived many Washington winters, he looked more like a retired professor than someone connected to power. A few feet away, Claire Whitmore continued watching him carefully. Something about his composure bothered her. She had spent years working crowded public events. People usually reacted predictably when confronted. Some became defensive. Others became nervous. Malcolm didn't either. His expression remained steady. His posture remained relaxed. It was as if he understood something nobody else did. Across the street, A reporter named Evan Brooks lowered his microphone for a moment and studied the older man more closely. The face seemed familiar. Not familiar in the way celebrities were familiar. It was something deeper. A memory sitting just beyond reach. Evan frowned and tried to place it. Meanwhile, Lena finally zipped her folder closed. "Thank you for helping me," she said. Most people just walked by. Malcolm glanced toward the crowd. "People are often distracted," he replied. "It does not always mean they do not care." The answer surprised her. Most adults would have criticized the crowd. Malcolm chose understanding instead. The wind shifted again, carrying the scent of wet concrete and fresh rain through the plaza. Somewhere above them, a courthouse clock chimed the hour. Malcolm checked his watch briefly. He was expected inside soon, yet there was no sign of urgency. Years of public service had taught him patience. Years of facing assumptions had taught him something even more valuable. Character revealed itself best when nobody thought you were important. That lesson had followed him through every stage of his life. As the cameras continued rolling, viewers across the country saw only an older black man standing quietly beside a child. They did not see decades of legal scholarship. They did not see historic opinions that had shaped national conversations. They did not see one of the sharpest legal minds in America. They saw exactly what Malcolm allowed them to see. And for the moment, that was enough. But not for much longer. Because somewhere inside the growing crowd, someone was finally beginning to recognize him, and the realization was about to change everything. Officer Claire Whitmore had spent nearly a decade building her reputation. In news articles, she was described as disciplined, dependable, and fearless under pressure. Local television stations often requested interviews after major community events because she spoke with confidence and projected authority. Standing in front of cameras felt natural to her. Being watched never made her uncomfortable. In many ways, she had come to expect it. As rain continued falling across the courthouse plaza, Claire became increasingly aware that dozens of lenses were pointed in her direction. Every movement was being recorded. Every word could become a headline. Instead of making her cautious, the attention strengthened her certainty. She believed she was maintaining order in a situation that could easily spiral into confusion. Around her, reporters adjusted rain covers over their equipment while producers monitored live feeds from mobile control trucks parked along the curb. The atmosphere carried a strange energy, part political event, part public spectacle. Claire stepped forward again, placing herself between Malcolm Hayes and the growing crowd. The gesture looked authoritative on camera. Several viewers watching from home would later describe her as confident. Others would call her confrontational. At that moment, nobody knew how important the distinction would become. Malcolm remained still. Water rolled from the edge of his umbrella onto the marble pavement below. His expression showed neither irritation nor fear. Years spent inside courtrooms had taught him the value of patience. He had seen heated arguments dissolve under calm reasoning. He had watched powerful people lose credibility because they could not control their emotions. Remaining composed was not an effort. It was a habit. Claire studied him carefully. Something about his calmness felt unusual. Most people reacted emotionally when challenged in public. Yet the older man beside the young girl seemed entirely unaffected by the attention surrounding him. "Sir," Claire said firmly, "I need you to move away from this area." Malcolm looked toward the courthouse entrance before returning his gaze to her. "Officer, I understand your concern," he replied. But the young lady was simply gathering her belongings. "There is no problem here." Lena nodded again. "He helped me," she said, louder this time. Several nearby reporters heard her clearly. A few exchanged glances. The explanation sounded reasonable. Claire, however, had already formed her conclusion. The crowd had begun watching too closely for her to retreat now. Behind a camera near the front barricade, Evan Brooks continued staring at Malcolm. The feeling of familiarity grew stronger with every passing second. He knew he had seen that face before. Not recently. Not in person. Somewhere else. Somewhere significant. His mind raced through interviews, public hearings, magazine covers, and newspaper photographs. Then his eyes widened slightly. The recognition was almost there. Almost. Across the plaza, courthouse security officers emerged near the entrance. They appeared relaxed, unconcerned by the situation unfolding outside. Malcolm noticed them, but said nothing. The rain softened into a light mist. The city noise seemed distant. For one brief moment, Everything felt suspended between misunderstanding and revelation. Claire adjusted her stance, determined to assert control. Malcolm quietly checked the time once more. And several feet away, Evan Brooks finally remembered where he had seen that face before. The realization struck him so suddenly that he nearly dropped his microphone. The realization hit Evan Brooks with the force of a forgotten memory suddenly returning in perfect detail. He had seen that face countless times before, not on a street corner, not at a public demonstration, but in national newspapers, legal journals, and televised hearings watched by millions. His pulse quickened. He lowered his microphone and pulled out his phone, scrolling rapidly through archived photos. The rain dotted the screen, but the image was clear enough. The same thoughtful eyes, the same calm expression, the same unmistakable presence. Evan looked up from the phone and back at the man standing quietly beside Lena Carter. It was him, yet somehow nobody else seemed to realize it. Around the plaza, the live broadcast continued. Reporters delivered updates. Camera operators shifted angles. Producers monitored audience reactions. The story everyone believed they were covering was beginning to fade beneath a much larger one that had not yet revealed itself. Claire Whitmore remained focused on maintaining control. She could feel dozens of cameras tracking every movement she made. The attention fueled her confidence. From her perspective, hesitation would look like uncertainty, and uncertainty was something she never wanted associated with her name. "Sir, I am asking you one more time to step away from the area," she said. Her tone remained professional, but the tension underneath it had become visible. Malcolm Hayes listened carefully. Rain gathered along the edge of his umbrella before falling in steady drops to the marble below. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he glanced toward Lena. The young girl stood quietly clutching her blue folder against her chest. She looked overwhelmed by the growing attention. Malcolm understood that feeling. He had spent much of his life watching people make assumptions before learning the truth. Finally he spoke. His voice was calm enough that several nearby reporters instinctively leaned closer to hear him. "Officer, authority is strongest when it is guided by patience." The words were simple, yet something about them immediately changed the atmosphere. A few members of the crowd exchanged curious looks. Others fell silent. Claire narrowed her eyes. She interpreted the statement as a challenge. Malcolm had not raised his voice. He had not argued. But his calm refusal to become emotional made the situation harder to control. Evan stared at him in disbelief. The phrase itself sounded familiar. He had heard similar language before during judicial hearings broadcast from Washington. The connection became impossible to ignore. His hands trembled slightly as he looked between the photograph on his phone and the man standing 20 feet away. Nearby, courthouse security personnel began moving toward the entrance. One of them glanced outside and immediately slowed. His expression changed. Another officer followed his gaze. Both men suddenly stood straighter. Neither appeared alarmed. Instead, they looked surprised. Malcolm noticed them approaching but remained focused on Lena. "You should keep your papers dry," he told her gently. "Some opportunities begin with a single sheet of paper." She smiled for the first time since the crowd had surrounded them. The moment felt strangely peaceful despite the growing tension around them. Then Evan took a step forward, his heart racing. The words were already forming in his mind. In another few seconds, he would say them out loud. And once he did, nothing in the plaza would remain the same. Before Evan Brooks could speak, another voice cut through the rain. "Officer Whitmore." The words came from one of the courthouse security supervisors approaching from the entrance. His pace was quick but controlled. Claire turned toward him, clearly irritated by the interruption. The live cameras immediately shifted direction. Anything unexpected was news. The supervisor stopped a few feet away and glanced at Malcolm. For a brief moment, his professional expression cracked into visible confusion. Then he straightened his posture. "Sir," he said respectfully. Malcolm offered a small nod but did not respond. Claire noticed the exchange instantly. Something about it felt wrong. Security personnel did not usually greet random civilians that way. Around them, reporters sensed a shift in the atmosphere. Conversations grew quieter. Even the crowd seemed to lean closer. Rain tapped softly against umbrellas and camera covers. The courthouse clock echoed across the plaza once more. Evan looked from Malcolm to the supervisor and back again. His pulse raced. He knew exactly who he was looking at now. The certainty settled over him like a weight. Yet he hesitated. Announcing it publicly would change everything. Claire folded her arms. "Is there a problem?" she asked. The supervisor appeared caught between two obligations. He glanced at Malcolm again, almost seeking permission. Malcolm remained calm. "No problem," he said gently. "Everyone is simply trying to do their job." The answer only deepened the confusion. Most people would have used the opportunity to defend themselves. Malcolm seemed more interested in easing tension than escalating it. Lena stood quietly beside him, clutching her folder against her jacket. She could feel the adults around her becoming nervous. Even at 12 years old, she recognized the signs. People stopped talking. People avoided eye contact. People began questioning assumptions they had been confident about only moments earlier. Claire, however, doubled down on her certainty. The presence of cameras made retreat feel impossible. Millions of viewers were watching. Every second that passed increased the pressure. "Sir," she said firmly, "you have repeatedly refused instructions to move from this area." Malcolm met her gaze. There was no anger in his eyes. No frustration. Only patience. "Officer," he replied, "sometimes the most important thing a person can do is pause long enough to understand what they are seeing." The statement hung in the air. Several reporters lowered their microphones, absorbing the words. Evan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He had heard language like that before. Not in interviews. Not in speeches. In judicial opinions quoted across the nation. The realization was now impossible to ignore. Nearby, two additional courthouse officials emerged through the main doors. The moment they saw Malcolm, both immediately changed direction and began walking toward him. Their expressions carried unmistakable respect. One removed his hat despite the rain. The crowd noticed. The reporters noticed. Claire noticed. For the first time all afternoon, uncertainty appeared on her face. Only for a second, but the cameras caught it. The plaza had become strangely quiet. The rain softened. The city noise faded into the distance. Everyone seemed to be waiting for someone to say what many were suddenly beginning to suspect. Evan tightened his grip on the microphone. His producer's voice crackled through his earpiece, asking what was happening. Evan swallowed hard. Then he took a step forward. The next words out of his mouth would be heard across the entire country. For a moment, nobody spoke. The courthouse plaza seemed suspended in time, caught between assumption and truth. Rain drifted softly through the gray afternoon, turning the marble steps into sheets of reflected light. The red glow of camera indicators flickered against wet pavement. Microphones remained raised. Reporters remained frozen. Even the distant traffic seemed quieter than before. Malcolm Hayes stood exactly where he had been standing all along. He had not moved closer to the cameras. He had not tried to explain himself. He had not demanded respect. Instead, he simply adjusted his grip on the umbrella and looked down at Lena Carter. The young girl's hands were trembling slightly around her blue folder. She was trying to understand why dozens of adults suddenly appeared nervous. Malcolm noticed immediately. "You did nothing wrong," he told her gently. "Remember that." Lena nodded. The reassurance settled her more than anything else had that afternoon. Around them, courthouse officials exchanged uneasy glances. One of them quietly stepped aside and spoke into a radio. Another remained near the entrance, watching Malcolm with visible respect. Their behavior did not go unnoticed. Claire Whitmore saw every detail. The confidence that had carried her through the afternoon was beginning to crack. Small questions had started appearing in the back of her mind. Why were senior courthouse personnel treating this man differently? Why did experienced reporters suddenly look uncertain? Why had the crowd become so quiet? She glanced toward the officials, then back toward Malcolm. He looked exactly the same as he had 10 minutes earlier. An older black man in a simple coat, standing in the rain beside a child. Yet somehow the entire atmosphere around him had changed. Or perhaps, Claire realized, the atmosphere had always been there and she had failed to see it. Evan Brooks remained silent as well. His microphone hung at his side. The words he intended to say felt heavier now than they had moments ago. He understood that once spoken aloud, they could not be taken back. The story would instantly become national news. But something about Malcolm's calm presence made him hesitate. It was not fear. It was respect. The kind that arrived when a person recognized they were standing in the presence of someone whose influence reached far beyond a single afternoon. A cold breeze swept across the plaza. Water rippled through shallow puddles near the barricades. Somewhere above, an American flag moved gently against the cloudy sky. Malcolm looked toward the courthouse entrance. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. Years of public service had taught him that people often revealed their character during moments of misunderstanding. Sometimes they revealed wisdom. Sometimes they revealed prejudice. Sometimes they revealed fear. Yet he had also learned something else. The truth never needed to rush. It arrived eventually on its own schedule. Claire swallowed hard. For the first time that day, she felt uncertain about her own judgment. The feeling unsettled her. The cameras continued recording every second. Millions of viewers remained unaware that they were witnessing the final quiet moments before a revelation that would send shockwaves far beyond the courthouse steps. Then Evan Brooks slowly lifted his microphone, drew a steady breath, and prepared to speak the name that would change everything. The silence finally broke. Evan Brooks stepped forward, his shoes splashing lightly through a shallow puddle as dozens of cameras instinctively turned toward him. His voice, usually confident and measured, carried an edge of disbelief. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think there is something everyone here needs to understand." The crowd shifted. Producers pressed fingers against their headsets. Reporters stopped whispering. Even the rain seemed to soften. Evan looked directly at Malcolm Hayes before glancing back toward the nearest camera. "The gentleman standing here is Justice Malcolm Hayes." For one long second, nobody reacted. The words seemed too unexpected to process. Then the meaning landed. Faces changed. Eyes widened. Conversations died in mid-sentence. A producer dropped a clipboard. A cameraman lowered his lens and immediately raised it again as if afraid he had heard incorrectly. Across the plaza, one reporter hurriedly searched her phone. Another stared at Malcolm in complete shock. The live audience watching across America received the news at the same moment. Social media feeds exploded almost instantly. Inside newsrooms hundreds of miles away, editors began calling producers. Justice Malcolm Hayes, Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States, standing quietly in the rain beside a young girl. The realization spread through the crowd like a wave. Claire Whitmore felt the blood drain from her face. For several seconds, she simply stared at Malcolm. The world around her seemed distant, muffled, unreal. She looked toward the courthouse officials who had approached earlier. Their expressions suddenly made sense. She looked toward Evan's phone. She looked toward the cameras. Then she looked back at Malcolm. Nothing about him had changed. He was still standing calmly beneath the same umbrella, still protecting Lena from the rain, still carrying himself with quiet dignity. The only thing that had changed was what everyone now understood about him. Lena blinked in surprise. "You are a judge?" she asked softly. Malcolm smiled. "Yes, young lady. That is my job." She looked amazed. "Like the Supreme Court?" Malcolm nodded once. "Something like that." The simplicity of the answer only deepened the contrast. Around them, reporters rushed to verify what was already obvious. Phones appeared everywhere. Names, photographs, biographies, and court opinions filled glowing screens. Every search returned the same result. Evan had been right. Claire's confidence evaporated completely. The certainty that had guided every decision she made that afternoon now felt fragile and misplaced. She replayed every word in her mind, every assumption, every conclusion. For the first time, she saw the situation from a different perspective, not through the lens of authority, not through the pressure of cameras, through the lens of simple fairness. Malcolm noticed her expression, yet there was no satisfaction in his eyes, no triumph, no desire to embarrass anyone. That seemed impossible to many people watching. Most expected anger. Most expected a public confrontation. Instead, Malcolm simply adjusted his umbrella and glanced toward the courthouse entrance. The rain continued falling softly around them. And as the shock settled over the plaza, one truth became impossible to ignore. The most powerful person there had never tried to prove he was important. Everyone else had simply failed to recognize him. The shock lingered long after the revelation. Nobody seemed eager to speak first. Reporters who had spent their careers asking difficult questions suddenly struggled to find words. The courthouse plaza remained wrapped in a strange stillness, broken only by the soft rhythm of rain against umbrellas and marble. Claire Whitmore stood motionless. The confidence that had once felt unshakable was gone. In its place sat something far heavier. Understanding. She looked at Malcolm Hayes and realized that the most painful part of the afternoon was not that she had failed to recognize a Supreme Court justice. It was that she had never truly tried to understand the man standing in front of her before making assumptions about him. The distinction mattered more than any title ever could. Slowly, Claire stepped forward. The cameras followed immediately. Millions of viewers watched in silence. Her voice, when it finally came, sounded different from before. Quieter, more human. "Justice Hayes," she said, swallowing hard. "I owe you an apology." Malcolm met her eyes, but said nothing. Claire continued. "I believed I understood the situation before I had all the facts. I should have listened more carefully. I should have shown more patience." The words were not polished. They were not prepared. That was precisely why they felt genuine. Nearby, courthouse officials remained silent. Evan Brooks lowered his microphone slightly. Even the reporters understood that this moment belonged to something larger than a headline. Malcolm looked toward Lena Carter. The young girl was watching closely, absorbing every second. Children often learn more from what adults did than what they said. Malcolm knew that. He also knew that the next few moments would shape what she remembered long after the cameras disappeared. "Officer Whitmore," he said calmly. "Everyone makes mistakes." Claire lowered her eyes. The simple response seemed to affect her more than any criticism could have. Malcolm continued. "What matters is whether we learn from them." Rain drifted through the gray afternoon sky. The courthouse flag moved gently overhead. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Then Malcolm turned his attention fully toward Lena. "Do you accept her apology?" he asked. The question surprised everyone. It surprised Claire most of all. Lena blinked. She looked at Claire, then back at Malcolm. Finally, she nodded. "Yes," she said quietly. A small smile touched Malcolm's face. "Good," he replied. "Because forgiveness is often harder than judgment." Claire exhaled slowly. The tension she had carried for the last hour seemed to leave her shoulders all at once. Around them, several members of the crowd exchanged thoughtful looks. This was not the ending they expected. They had anticipated anger, public humiliation, or demands for punishment. Instead, they were witnessing something far rarer. Grace. Malcolm could have used his status to embarrass someone who had misjudged him. He chose not to. He could have focused on his own dignity. Instead, he focused on teaching a lesson. The cameras continued recording. But now the story had changed. It was no longer about power. It was about character. And in that quiet, rain-soaked moment outside the courthouse, everyone present understood who possessed the greater strength. The rain finally began to fade. What had started as a cold gray afternoon settled into a quiet mist drifting above the courthouse steps. The crowd remained gathered, but the energy had changed completely. Reporters who had arrived searching for controversy now found themselves standing in silence. Camera operators lowered their shoulders. Producers stopped rushing from one conversation to the next. Even the questions waiting on hundreds of lips seemed less important than the lesson they had just witnessed. Malcolm Hayes glanced toward the courthouse entrance one final time. Official duties still waited inside. Briefings, meetings, decisions, responsibilities that affected millions of lives. Yet before taking a single step forward, he looked down at Lena Carter. The young girl held her blue folder tightly against her chest. Unlike earlier, there was no fear in her eyes now. There was curiosity, confidence, something stronger than either. Malcolm smiled. "Keep those papers safe," he said. "You never know which opportunity might change your life." Lena smiled back. "I will, sir." Malcolm gave a small nod. Then he handed her the umbrella. The gesture surprised her. "But what about you?" she asked. Malcolm looked toward the courthouse doors only a short distance away. "I think I can manage the rest of the walk." The girl laughed softly and accepted it. Nearby, Claire Whitmore watched the exchange. The image stayed with her. Not the revelation. Not the cameras. Not the headlines that would inevitably follow. A simple act of kindness. A man who had every reason to focus on himself, choosing instead to make sure a child stayed dry on a rainy afternoon. Some lessons could not be taught in classrooms. Some arrived unexpectedly and stayed forever. Claire understood that now. As Malcolm began walking toward the courthouse, the crowd instinctively parted. Nobody told them to move. They simply did. Respect had replaced assumption. Evan Brooks lowered his microphone completely. For the first time all day, he was not thinking about ratings or breaking news alerts. He was thinking about character. The difference between being recognized and being worthy of recognition. The courthouse doors opened. Warm light spilled across the wet marble steps. Malcolm paused briefly before entering. Not to address the cameras. Not to make a statement. Instead, he turned and looked once more toward the plaza. His gaze settled on Lena, then on Claire, then on the crowd itself. The expression on his face carried neither pride nor resentment, only quiet understanding. Then he disappeared inside. The doors closed softly behind him. Outside, nobody moved for several seconds. Rainwater slid slowly down the courthouse columns. The American flag above the entrance fluttered against a clearing sky. Lena stood beneath the umbrella, watching the doors long after they had closed. Claire remained still as well, thoughtful and humbled. Around them, reporters finally began packing their equipment. The story was over. Yet somehow it felt larger than any headline they could write. Because in the end, the most powerful moment had not been the discovery of who Malcolm Hayes was. It had been the reminder that every person deserves dignity before their title is known. And as the last clouds drifted away from Washington, the plaza grew quiet enough to hear nothing at all except the soft sound of justice leaving its lesson behind.